Hello, everyone, and thank you for those of you who arrived on time. So let's dive right on with this new STIG space policy webinar. We have a quite big program, very interesting program today. So yes, let's start. My name is Quentin Verspieren. I'm an assistant professor of space policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy of the University of Tokyo, and I had the pleasure of hosting this series of STIG space policy webinars. And today's webinar will focus on new directions in lunar archaeology and heritage. But before starting with lunar archaeology, let me talk a bit about what is the STIG program to which I belong. So the Science, Technology, and Innovation Governance Program. It is a university-wide program at the University of Tokyo for education and research on technology governance that provides education, a graduate certificate for students in master and PhD program on science, technology, and innovation policy. And it is held through a joint partnership of the Graduate School of Public Policy, Graduate School of Engineering, and various other graduate schools at the University of Tokyo. And it's part of an overall program of the Japanese government called CIREX, which has a very complex meaning, basically science for policy and policy for science, that organizes similar programs in other Japanese universities, such as Kyoto University, Osaka University, etc. We have, on average, around 200 students registered as part of the STIG program, with around 25% from public policy, 25% from engineering, and the other half, roughly, from various kind of schools, so frontier science, agriculture, art and science, medicine. So we really have a diverse cohort of students, which proves really interesting in our courses and research projects that are truly interdisciplinary. So we have a quite big space policy team at the STIG program with 3 full-time faculty, including myself, and numerous visiting faculty and researchers from other universities or from the Japanese space agencies. And we also have affiliated faculty from other departments. So space is actually one part of what STIG does. We also do biomedical, nuclear research, various kind of areas dealing with technology governance. In terms of space, so we frequently publish books and articles. In particular, I want to highlight our latest publication on space programs in ASEAN. It's the first book that tried to have a comprehensive perspective on why space is important in ASEAN countries, how do they manage to develop space capabilities in these countries, build a workforce, and more generally trying to look at why, even though you're a developing country, you may have limited government resources, why space and space technologies may matter for your development. And so we are involved in various studies. We work with international think tanks, and we also collaborate a lot with the Japanese industry. So overall, these brief remarks are just to say that if you're looking for a leading space policy education and research center in Asia, the Graduate School of Public Policy and the STIG program are what you're looking for. We are open to students. We have a lot of students interested in space policy. I see some of them are in the audience today. And so we welcome students, early or mid-career professional that are interested in pursuing a master or PhD degree in public policy with research concentration in space policy. We're also open to joint research projects, and we do our best to contribute to disseminating space-related information in the Asia-Pacific region, in particular through our series of STIG space policy webinar that are held on a monthly basis. So we started in February. Today's event is the 3rd webinar. And you can find our past events, so including the Space Policy webinar and other events, such as a recent international symposium on the future of lunar and cislunar activities that was also attended by our keynote speaker today. So please check our YouTube channel if you want to see what we have been doing so far. So today's webinar will focus on new directions in lunar archaeology and heritage. Briefly, the structure will be the following. We will start with a keynote speech by Dr. Alice Gorman of Flinders University, followed by 3 presentations from students of space archaeology at Flinders University, presenting some of their case studies on various missions to the moon. And without further ado, I would like to call on stage Dr. Gorman for her keynote. So let me introduce, for the very few of you who may not know Dr. Gorman, who she is. She's an associate professor at the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Science at Flinders University. She's an internationally recognized leader in the field of space archaeology. Her research on space exploration has been featured in National Geographic, New Scientist, and Archaeology magazine. She's also a faculty member at the International Space University's Southern Hemisphere Space Program in Adelaide. Her book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, Archaeology and the Future, received numerous awards, and I strongly recommend you to check it. She has worked extensively in indigenous heritage management, providing advice for the mining industry, urban development, government departments, local councils, and native title groups in various parts of Australia. Dr. Gorman, the floor is yours, and we will have time for questions. So if you have any question for Dr. Gorman, put it in the Q&A box or raise your hand at the end of the presentation. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Quentin, for that kind introduction. And it is indeed a pleasure to be part of this webinar today. I've just shared my screen, so hopefully everybody can see that. Before I start talking about these new directions, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I acknowledge their deep connections to the cultural and natural heritage of their lands, waters and sky, and I acknowledge and offer my respect to their leaders, past and elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of all the countries that the audience is joining us from today. So to talk about new directions in lunar archaeology and heritage, I'm going to start by actually saying what heritage is. Generally in the heritage world, we divide this into natural heritage, which is things like environments and ecologies, geological formations, and cultural heritage, which is things created by humans, generally places, objects, practices, and ideas. The material stuff we say is tangible heritage, and the beliefs and practices and rituals that go along with them are called intangible heritage, and there are UNESCO level conventions protecting both of these. Essentially, a really quick way to define heritage is something from the past that communities or individuals in the present feel is important to pass on to future generations. And indeed, the United Nations has a declaration on the importance of present generations conserving resources for future generations, and this includes heritage as well. Access to cultural heritage is considered to be part of a suite of human rights by the United Nations, and they have written extensively about the benefits of access to cultural heritage and of preserving cultural heritage to community and individual well-being. And the picture I'm showing you on this slide is an interesting terrestrial heritage site, something that many people know a lot about. This is the complex of pyramids in Egypt. And this is an interesting place because it can be seen, not quite with the naked eye, but with a pair of binoculars. You can see the pyramids on Earth from the International Space Station. So there are connections between heritage places on Earth and heritage places in space. All of these things are connected. So having said that, I'm going to take us to our place of inquiry today, which is the moon. And there's actually quite a lot of human material culture on the moon now. So this slide just gives you a little tiny snapshot of what's up there. So there are more than 100 places where human objects have made some impact on the moon. But just to give you a few of those highlights, there are a number of robotic landing craft, and these include things like the USSR's Lunar series of robotic probes. The US has the Ranger and Surveyor series, which were precursors to setting up the Apollo missions. The USSR has two famous lunar rovers, one of which is now privately owned. And China has landed 3 missions on the surface of the moon as well, and they have 2 rovers as well. So as well as that, there are objects in lunar orbit. It's often quite hard to figure out just how many of these there are. But from looking at the latest information I can find, there's been at least 39 orbiting lunar objects that have been inserted into lunar orbit. Of those, there are still 4 which appear to be in orbit around the moon, and over 13 of these have either deliberately or accidentally crashed onto the surface of the moon, leaving little craters. And of course, most famously, there were 6 crewed missions in the 1960s and early 70s where humans actually made their way to the moon and created archaeological sites. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that the whole moon itself is of enormous significance to human history and human culture, both as a natural and cultural object. And we could also consider that the whole moon has heritage values of its own. So that's just a little tiny window into some of the places that are on the surface of the moon, and we'll explore some more of them in detail as we go through our webinar tonight. So heritage has become a bit of a hot topic in the space world as plans to go back to the moon accelerate. And in this regard, a number of recent guidance documents and principles have made explicit reference to heritage. So this is just really in the last few years. These include the Vancouver recommendations on space mining, of which Article 21 references the need to identify and do impact assessments on sites and places of natural and cultural heritage. The Hague building blocks, which were the result of years of work attempting to set up good principles for operations in space, also has an article dealing explicitly with cultural heritage and raises the idea of having an internationally endorsed heritage list. The Artemis Accords, which were released in 2020, I think, are a set of principles that the US proposes to operate by when they send people back to the moon. And there is one of these explicitly on protecting cultural heritage. The US has also introduced a piece of legislation called the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage Act. This applies only to NASA missions and to US personnel, but basically it says that considerations of heritage value need to be taken into account on the lunar surface. So this is the only explicit piece of national heritage legislation that deals with sites off Earth. And as we speak, the Global Expert Group for Sustainable Lunar Activities is working on another document that is going to have a whole sub-report on natural and cultural heritage protection on the moon, and that's going to be presented to the United Nations at the end of 2022, and I'm part of that group working on that report. So there's a lot of discussion about heritage issues on the moon at the moment. Fortunately, we have a lot of terrestrial precedents that we can use to approach this subject. And one of the most important and effective is the Borough Charter, most recent version 2013, which was the product of the Australian chapter of the International Council of Monuments and Sites. It was established precisely because European-based heritage charters were not good at covering the diversity of issues that might come, for example, with Indigenous sites. So this makes the Borough Charter extremely effective for applying to space. Just some of the key elements of the Borough Charter are that you should do as much as is necessary and as little as possible in relation to protecting heritage. So you don't need to do stuff that doesn't need to be done. Good heritage management is based on an assessment of cultural significance. And in general, the aim is to retain cultural significance wherever possible. Sometimes it's unavoidable to disturb or diminish cultural significance, but that should always be the aim. The Borough Charter also says that the place or the setting or the landscape is a key part of cultural significance of places and objects. And we'll see this as we have a look at a few examples of applying the Borough Charter. Principally, the Borough Charter categorises cultural significance under 5 different headings. And there are other cultural significance categories around, but you will find that most of them actually fit quite neatly into these 5. Just to give you a brief description of them, they're historic, scientific, aesthetic, social, and spiritual significance. Historic significance is fairly self-evident. It means an association with important events or political or social processes or well-known or outstanding people. Scientific significance, in the case of space, it's not necessarily the scientific work carried out by a mission or an instrument. It's what we could learn from that place by studying it. Or another way to think of it is to say, if that place or object no longer existed, what research questions could we not answer or even ask at all? So it's about looking at these places and objects as things that can be studied in their own right. Aesthetic significance isn't what it maybe sounds like. It's not about whether something is aesthetically pleasing or not. It's more about the sensory experience. It's how a place or object engages our senses, how it looks, feels, smells even, the scale of it in relation to the human body, how it affects people's experience of being in that place. Social significance is how contemporary communities esteem a place. And basically, you could have somewhere that had incredibly high historic significance, let's say, but if no one cared about it, then its heritage value might actually be quite low. You need people to be engaged with things or to care about things to justify committing resources to preserving them or protecting them. So social significance is very important. It overlaps a bit with spiritual significance, which is about the things people believe, the spiritual value they place in things, which is obviously also very social. So it turns out that you can apply these categories of significance fairly easily to places and objects in space, around in orbit around the Earth, on the Moon, and other celestial bodies as well. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of different kinds of significance. The first one, to explore social significance a little bit, is the Japanese lunar mission Kaguya, which was launched in 2007, operated around the Moon until 2009, and which currently has components on the surface of the Moon and still in orbit. So the aim of this spacecraft, this mission, was to carry out a whole range of experiments mapping lunar gravity. It had a high definition camera to map the lunar terrain. And the main spacecraft released 2 little satellites, which you can actually see on this picture. They were called Okina and Una. Okina crashed on the Moon in 2009. The main spacecraft crashed on the Moon a little bit earlier in 2009, and Una is apparently still in orbit. So it clearly has a lot of historic significance. It was the largest mission to the Moon after the Apollo programs in the 1960s. It was a very serious scientific effort that produced outstanding results. So all of those things are terribly important. But we could say one way to measure its social significance is how many people engaged with it. And there was an extensive education program that sent images and DVDs out to schools and communities across the world. Kaguya produced some of the most stunning images of the lunar terrain. And these were widely disseminated. And in fact, a whole new batch of images was released only in 2016. So this is still going on. And as part of the mission, a wonderful program was created called Moonbell, which basically was a sort of a widget that translated the elevation data that was acquired from the 3 satellites to convert it into music, to sonify it. And effectively what you could do with Moonbell was almost drop a stylus onto the surface of the moon and play it like a record at any location that you chose. So this was a wonderful way of sort of engaging people with this mission. And as recently as last year, the images from Kaguya were being used in different projects. So the artist Sean Duran created 2 videos, The Moon in Real Time, which you can watch online from the Kaguya images. So in terms of social significance, it has reached a huge number of people. It produced stunning images of wonderful Earthrise images, but it also tells a story. So the name of the mission is Kaguya, the Lunar Princess, the princess from the moon. The names of the 2 sub-satellites relate to her parents when she came down from the moon to Earth and became part of a human family. And this is a story that was written in the 10th century during the Heian period in Japan. So there are very symbolic references to a long and deep culture as well. So I would argue that there is a very high social significance for these objects that are on the moon and in orbit and of the whole mission. As an example of historic significance, we can take Apollo 11, probably the best known lunar archaeological and heritage site. So many ways to describe how it might be significant. But to look at one aspect of its historic significance, as archaeologists, a very obvious comparison of the Apollo 11 footprints is with the site of Laetoli in Tanzania, where very early bipedal human ancestors walked through soft volcanic ash and left a trackway 3.7 million years ago. The visual resemblance to the Apollo 11 astronauts tracking their way through the soft grey lunar dust in the year 1969 is quite striking to anyone who's got an archaeological background, I think. We could even project this into the future to how footprints might look on other planets. So you could argue that an aspect of its historic significance is this long-term evolutionary perspective, which we can now place into a solar system context. So what is the issue here? We have numerous missions planned to go back to the moon. There are 4 missions right at the moment. There are plans to mine the moon, to send humans back there, possibly to set up a habitat and live there. What this is going to mean for these places is that they are firstly going to be open to visitation, which may well involve things like looting and souveniring. But perhaps more important than that, we know that lunar dust is a big problem for anything on the surface of the moon, anything moving around. It's very, very abrasive, and we have evidence that it has abraded the surface of human spacecraft on the lunar surface. And as there's more activity on the moon, more of this dust is going to be stirred up, and this could well have a negative impact on all of the places and objects that have heritage value and archaeological value. In 2011, NASA produced a set of heritage guidelines for the moon, which can equally be applied to any non-NASA site on the surface as well. One of the recommendations they had was to set up what we call in the heritage world buffer zones around sites. So these are like exclusion zones that you can't go inside. There were instructions on how to approach sites either on the surface or in overflight to minimize the amount of this abrasive dust that was stirred up. And adherence to these guidelines is now actually part of the One Small Step Act in the US as well. So we have some pointers about how to prevent damage to these sites. And this is where I'm going to start talking about some of the new directions in lunar heritage management. So one project that I'm working on at the moment is in collaboration with CSIRO, Australia's leading government scientific research establishment. And we are going to simulate the lunar boot prints in a lunar soil simulant, and this particular one comes from Colorado, and then perform experiments to work out just how much force is needed to start eroding the structure and shape of these footprints. So this will be like mimicking rocket exhaust and rocket plumes from different distances and at different forces, so that we can get a handle on exactly, for example, how far away you ought to be to have little to no impact on these footprints. And of course, there are rover tracks and many other traces left in the lunar regolith as well. So we're just starting out with this experiment. It's going to have a practical application to lunar heritage management, and we might well get some good data that can be used for, protecting other lunar installations and equipment as well. And as far as we know, we're the first project to attempt to get some data about this specific problem. So just starting, as I say, so hopefully we will have some interesting data by the end of the year. But this isn't the only way we can think of to protect lunar heritage. A growing area in terrestrial heritage management is using digital models to disseminate data about objects, to enable people to interact with them and to reconstruct heritage places. So one of the most famous examples of this is Chauvet Cave in southern France. So this was an amazing Paleolithic rock art site dated 32,000 years ago, which has some of the most extraordinary art of that era that's ever been discovered. But when it was found in 1994, people knew there would be a problem because the cave of Lascaux, which has similar aged art, had suffered greatly from visitation. It was growing mold, the paintings were being destroyed. So what they decided to do was make a 3D replica of the actual cave, which they did using digital data. And this is, you can go to this place now, you can go into the replica and have the experience of actually being in this place. Now, people are starting to do something a little bit similar for the moon. So in 2005, the Lunar Explorer virtual reality simulation was made where you could like walk around the moon, and the same organization are now developing virtual moon, and this is going to have a heritage component where you can go to Apollo 11, walk around it, pick up the objects, turn them around, which is a type of recording archaeologists are using on excavations and in artifact analyses right now. So this is a way of experiencing the site without causing any damage, without stirring up any of that deadly dust. And I was very excited a bit earlier in the month to see that the Department of Archaeology at Durham University in the UK was planning a lunar excavation. And initially I thought this is what they meant. I thought they meant a simulated excavation. So I got very excited. But if you look at the date on that image of the tweet, you will see it is April the 1st. And in reality, there's not much under the surface at Apollo 11. So an excavation wouldn't really get you terribly far. But it's an indication of the way people are starting to think about, doing stuff on the moon. One of the really interesting things about the Chauvet experience is that when they surveyed people, many of them didn't realize that this was not the real cave. And their experience of the rock art was every bit as vivid and emotional and engaged as people who have visited the real thing or have been to a not replica rock art site. So this was really interesting. It showed that it didn't actually matter if things were real or not. And this leads us to the subject of authenticity. And this is a big thing for some people. So there is a very strong antiquities trade, a black market in antiquities, in which having something that is really an object from the deep past is worth a lot of money to people. But as the Chauvet example shows us to other people, it doesn't matter at all. You can have the same experience from a replica. This was something that was discussed in a meeting in the Japanese city of Nara in 1994, when the International Council of Monuments and Sites came up with the Nara document on authenticity. And I've just pulled a couple of clauses out there because it has some very interesting things to say. One aspect of the NARA document is that it is argued to have brought tangible and intangible heritage, the concepts of the material and the immaterial in heritage significance, closer together. But it also makes a couple of good points. That there isn't any kind of one perception of what's authentic and what's not authentic, and what is considered to be authentic actually differs between different cultures. So we can't make that judgment to cover all heritage places in all places and times, and it's necessary to take into account different cultural perceptions of what counts as authentic. So having brought that up, I want to sort of see how this might affect our assessment of the three objects related to the Kaguya mission on the moon. And if we look at current Japanese heritage legislation and philosophy, there are some aspects of it that are a little bit distinct compared to the normal kind of European-based heritage regimes. Excuse me for a second, I'm just going to have oh, I can't find my microphone. I'm just going to have a little sip of water. Oh. So some aspects of Japanese heritage philosophy are that greater entanglement of intangible and tangible heritage. So the materiality of a place or an object isn't necessarily going to take primacy over the associations of knowledge and cultural practice and stories from the past. And it's very interesting, I think, that this whole mission is associated with the tale of the bamboo cutter, where Kaguya the Moon Princess comes from. And I've shown you a wonderful illustration here which shows her return to the moon when her time on Earth was done. So we might think of these places on the moon as very physical places, which they are, but the associations they have with this, in fact, 10,000 year story, which still has so much resonance, I think also has to be taken into account. So they're on the moon now, but this also is a place very connected to Earth. And another interesting aspect of Japanese heritage philosophy is returning to sort of pre-1800s ideas of the landscape. It's very much at home with the idea of what's now called a cultural landscape, which is the combined works of human activities and natural processes, and with the social and emotional and spiritual aspects of how those landscapes are created. So this gives us a slightly different perspective on regarding these very technological objects, which are often assessed for their place in developing space technology or demonstrating that someone was first to the moon or second to the moon or did some activity first on the moon. With this heritage philosophy, we can situate the three Kaguya spacecraft as part of a more general incorporation of the moon into culture and history that dates from the 10th century. Japanese heritage law, which is, in fact, Japan has some of the oldest heritage legislation anywhere in the world, dating from the 1870s onwards, but the current law, the law for the protection of cultural properties, is not very geared towards industrial or contemporary heritage. But if you take these other values into account, there is a possibility that the Kaguya objects could be registered under this legislation, although the Outer Space Treaty would make it only the objects and not the kind of places or sites themselves. I'm not quite sure how much time I have left, so hopefully I still do have a bit. So just to kind of wrap up, I think considering these issues for me means that we have to accept that there is no one kind of lunar heritage. According to the NARA document, we need to take into account specific philosophies and cultural traditions when we approach sites from different nations and different communities. So there's no one size fits all heritage management solution for places on the moon. And as the Borough Charter says, we do really need to start making those decisions based on our assessment of cultural significance. Something that you find is very strong in lunar heritage is nationalist accounts of what's significant and what isn't. And of course, the US tends to dominate those accounts, particularly with the Apollo missions. So I think it is important and interesting to consider sites launched by other states and to think of what their heritage significance might be. So that provides us a counter narrative to the hegemony of US narratives of space. But there is a tension in this. So the Outer Space Treaty says that space is the province of all humanity or the heritage of all humanity, but that doesn't quite work with the emphasis on nationalism in many of these stories. So that's an interesting tension to try and resolve. And finally, we have to think about what does authenticity, in the sense of things that are considered to be more real than other things, and the digital or other kinds of replications and disseminations of those places. What does that really mean in terms of how people experience these places? Unlike the heritage places on Earth, which we could all potentially go to, even if we don't, it's highly unlikely any of us are ever going to get to the moon, to even get close to Apollo 11, for example, even if we could do that without causing damage through the movement of lunar dust. So what is it that makes these sites important to people who can never, ever go there? What are the aspects of cultural significance that will enable us to create ways for people to connect with them and to experience their own sense of value from them? I'm going to leave that as an open-ended question and finish with a quote from one of my favorite authors, which brings us back to the idea that the whole moon as an object can in itself have heritage significance. So this is from the Pillow Book of Say Shawnigan, who was writing in the 10th century at the same time as the tale of the bamboo cutter, which gives the Kaguya mission its name. And she says, is one part of the Pillow Book, in the 7th month, when the heat is dreadful, everything in the building is kept open all through the night, and it's delightful to wake on moonlit nights and lie there looking out. Dark nights too are delightful, and as for the sight of the moon at dawn, words cannot describe the loveliness. Thank you. That is the end. So I'll stop sharing now, and I do hope I haven't gone over time.
It was perfect. Thank you very much, Alice, for your presentation. And I would say that I'm also a huge fan of Sei Shonagon, so it's always a pleasure to see some quote. And your background was a beautiful print from Hiroshige's, a truly perfect combination. So now if you have questions, please either put it in the Q&A box, chat, or raise your hand. To give you a bit of time, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you. So beyond the joke of Durham University, are there examples of either past missions or future missions that are targeting, let's say, inspecting or reviewing some existing heritage site on the moon? You're muted.
Myself. Back in 2000, I can't even remember, it might have been around 2009, there was a thing called the Google X Prize, which was for organizations of whatever kind to make a lunar rover that could revisit the Apollo sites and take material away, like take bits of them away, return them to Earth. And this fortunately never came to pass. Like after some discussion, they changed it from taking a bit away to just photographing it. But we know that even approaching the site can stir up this terrible dust. There's been, I think, enough sort of raising of awareness of the heritage issues for nobody to be directly proposing going to an old site to document it or to remove material. There's certainly some of the people interested in lunar mining are a little bit upset that they might not, or they might be discouraged from landing on top of Apollo 11 or going to any of these places. So they're sort of seeing that as an impediment to exploiting the resources of the moon. An objection which I find quite ridiculous, because there's like, 110 places in the whole moon that they're being asked to give some consideration to. So, I guess I'm a little bit not very receptive to that idea. But certainly as lunar mining starts to open up, that something that's going to be of interest is just how those materials have fared in the lunar environment. For, Lunar 2 is dated to 1959. It would be really interesting to see what condition the materials are in. So taking scientific samples, as Apollo 11 took a piece of Surveyor 3 back to Earth in 1967, that's not right, later in 1969, Surveyor 3 landed in 67. And we learned a lot about what happens to human manufactured materials in the lunar environment. So there will be some interest in doing that. And I think that's fine, but you don't want people to be doing it willy-nilly. It needs to be done with, a considered process, with a research rationale and a good justification. So I think there's enough sort of awareness now that people aren't just saying, oh, let's just go and visit this and do this. But I suspect there will be a lot of people who would really love to see those sites, in the flesh or inside a spacesuit or whatever.
Thank you very much. I can see maybe it's such a new topic for many people in our audience that they don't yet have questions, but I have another one. So it's about the, I would say, space archaeology community. From previous events that you attended and this presentation, you often mention researchers from universities working on it. But I'm wondering, what's the kind of expertise of space agencies on that, major space agencies? Do some of them have people working on the issue of space heritage? Or if not, how is your relationship with agencies? How do you discuss this kind of issues with them?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that no, they don't. And if they have people considering these issues, they are not qualified and trained professionals. But that's partially because I think, the space world has sort of finally come to realize that heritage is a thing, which is fantastic. But what they haven't yet realized is that heritage is a whole profession that requires expertise and a whole disciplinary area, which with a very long and deep scholarship, not just, as I have actually heard space people say, oh, it's a bit of a fluffy idea that I just had. Well, no, it isn't actually. There are whole university departments, professional associations, conventions. There's a whole international structure of regulation around cultural heritage that exist already. So I think it would be a really good outcome for agencies to have people with expertise in this field. I mean, I'm in conversation with the Australian Space Agency, so they have an interest, I guess, in this. And I would say also any nation that has signed on to the Artemis Accords, given one of those accords is about heritage, probably needs to start thinking about where they can access people with expertise, because there are often what seems intuitive or logical to someone with no background in heritage often is absolutely not the right way to go about things. So I think it really is critical to have people who are properly trained, and even more critical, have the background, the ethics background. Heritage is highly political and politicized, and you have to know what you're about. And you can see the moon at the moment, everyone kind of agrees, yes, we should protect heritage. But once people are on the surface, it's quite possible that this will be a source of conflict. And well, I won't talk about it now, but there are many potential implications for conflict over heritage places. So yeah, you don't need somebody blundering around in that environment who doesn't know the background to how these things have played out on Earth. So I would strongly encourage any space agency to consider accessing specific expertise around space heritage. And if they wanted to look to Flinders University graduates, I would not be objecting.
Of course. And so conversely, so space agencies don't have heritage specialists, but what about, let's say, government agencies in charge of heritage in major countries? So let's say ministries of culture, agencies for cultural affairs, do they care about space?
They're starting to. So most nations now will have people who have expertise in industrial heritage. And that is now starting to edge into 20th, 21st century stuff. And there's a whole field of archaeology called the archaeology of the contemporary past, which is post-World War II. And many of my colleagues in this area do have jobs in government heritage agencies. So I think probably there are more people skilled up in this area coming from the heritage side than the reverse, coming from the space side. And of course, me and my colleagues in space archaeology and heritage, we're out talking in the space community, but we're also obviously communicating with the archaeology and heritage community as well. And there's the whole field of space archaeology really started around the year 2000, so 22 years ago now. So over that time, the field has been established as a credible field. And there aren't that many people sort of working full time in it, but there's quite a few people who have sort of dipped in and out and have various levels of expertise. So it would be obviously great to get sort of more dialogue happening between those two communities. Someone's got a question.
We have a question from Mathieu Bataille from the European Space Policy Institute. So talks with UNESCO on that.
I am actually writing a report for UNESCO at the moment. So yes, so hopefully they're definitely taking more of an interest in it. And I hope when I finish this report, it might be sort of released and widely available as well.
And indeed, this can, if the UNESCO takes this issue seriously, this can help also governments to realize that this is an issue, like all the ministries of culture that linked with UNESCO. So
absolutely.
hopefully. Okay, so